they set up Rachel Torres on a blind date as entertainment. 3 college acquaintances who'd never outgrown the cruelty of adolescence now weaponizing their corporate expense accounts. The reservation at Harborview was confirmed for 8 o'clock, the kind of restaurant where chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors, and the cheapest entree cost more than Rachel earned in a day of brake repairs. Marcus had created the fake dating profile himself, selecting her most unflattering photo from social media and crafting messages that promised genuine interest from someone successful and kind. The other 2 had placed bets on how long she'd wait before realizing nobody was coming, whether she'd cry in public, if the humiliation would be visible enough to justify the effort they'd invested. They'd chosen Rachel specifically because her social media showed a life of honest struggle, someone who fixed cars in a garage on the edge of town and posted photos of sunset walks instead of vacation destinations. Her vulnerability made her the perfect target in their minds, someone whose hope could be manufactured and then destroyed for their amusement. Rachel stood in her apartment bathroom that evening, holding a dress she'd borrowed from her sister, the fabric nicer than anything in her own closet, but still obviously secondhand. She'd scrubbed her hands 3 times with pumice soap, but the grease remained embedded in the creases of her knuckles, permanent evidence of work that most people never acknowledged. Her reflection showed someone trying too hard, hair pulled back in a style that didn't quite suit her face, makeup applied with the uncertain hand of someone who rarely wore it. The hope in her eyes made her angry at herself because she knew better than to believe in easy solutions, in men who messaged strangers with promises of dinner and conversation. The online profile had seemed genuine, messages arriving consistently over 2 weeks with questions about her work and interests that suggested real curiosity. She'd allowed herself to imagine that someone might see past her oil-stained fingernails and secondhand clothes to the person underneath, someone who read poetry and volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. The taxi ride downtown felt like traveling to another planet, familiar streets transforming as industrial buildings gave way to glass towers and boutique shops. She'd given the driver the address twice because he'd seemed surprised that someone dressed like her would be heading to that particular neighborhood. Through the window, she watched couples strolling in evening wear that probably cost more than her monthly rent, their ease in that environment marking them as natives to a world where she would always be a foreigner. The driver's eyes had found hers in the rearview mirror multiple times during the journey, his expression shifting between curiosity and something resembling pity that made Rachel's stomach twist with preemptive embarrassment. She'd noticed him glance at the oil stain on her sleeve when she'd first climbed into the back seat, watched his assessment move from her borrowed dress to her worn shoes to her hands that still bore evidence of her trade, despite aggressive scrubbing. His silence felt loaded with judgments he was too professional to voice, but couldn't quite hide from his face. Rachel turned her attention deliberately toward the window, refusing to meet his eyes again, focusing instead on the city transforming around her as they drove deeper into neighborhoods where people like her only entered through service entrances or as hired help for events they'd never attend as guests. Street vendors selling flowers and newspapers gave way to boutique storefronts displaying single items in windows the size of her garage's waiting room, the minimalism itself a form of wealth signaling that announced prices beyond her comprehension. She watched a woman emerge from one such shop carrying a bag so small it could only contain jewelry or perhaps a scarf, the woman's casual confidence suggesting this purchase represented ordinary Tuesday activity rather than special occasion. Rachel's sister had saved for 3 months to buy the dress Rachel currently wore, hunting through consignment shops until finding something appropriate for the kind of restaurant where Marcus's fictional profile had suggested they'd meet. The memory of her sister's excitement while helping her prepare for this date made Rachel's chest constrict with shame that hadn't yet transformed into the anger it would eventually become when she fully processed what had been done to her. The taxi meter's steady climb mirrored Rachel's rising anxiety, each increment representing money she couldn't easily spare, even with the extra shifts she'd been taking at the garage, to build a small cushion for potential emergencies. She'd calculated carefully before accepting this date, determining that the taxi fare both ways would still leave her enough for groceries through next week if she was careful about portions and stuck to basics. Her independence had always mattered more than comfort, the ability to support herself without asking for help, a point of pride that made accepting her sister's loan for tonight feel like small defeat. The numbers on the meter seemed to accelerate as they entered the restaurant district, as though even the taxi's pricing structure acknowledged that people traveling to this neighborhood operated under different financial mathematics than those traveling away from it. Traffic thickened near the waterfront, where Harborview and similar establishments lined the street like jewels on display, each entrance promising experiences Rachel had only read about in reviews she'd never imagined writing herself. Valets in crisp uniforms moved between idling luxury cars with choreographed efficiency, their movements suggesting this was merely the visible portion of complex machinery designed to make wealthy people's evenings flow without friction or awareness of logistics. Rachel watched a couple exit a Tesla and hand their keys to a valet without glancing at his face, their attention already on the restaurant entrance and whatever awaited them inside. The casual dismissal of the young man's humanity stung in ways Rachel felt personally, recognition of how invisible service workers became to people accustomed to having their needs anticipated and met without acknowledgement. The driver pulled to the curb half a block from Harborview's entrance, explaining apologetically that he couldn't get closer due to the valet queue and suggesting she could walk the short distance easily enough. Rachel paid with bills she'd folded carefully in her wallet that morning, adding a tip that was probably too generous given her financial situation, but reflected her awareness that they were both people who worked for their money. He thanked her with surprise that made her wonder what kind of tips he usually received from passengers heading to restaurants like this, whether her modest generosity stood out against expectations of wealth that didn't translate into generosity. She climbed out onto the sidewalk and immediately felt exposed, aware of how her appearance contrasted with other pedestrians moving purposefully toward expensive destinations with the confidence of people who belonged. The walk to Harborview's entrance stretched longer than the actual distance suggested, each step carrying Rachel further from familiar territory into spaces designed to make people like her feel inadequate. She passed other restaurants with windows revealing candlelit interiors and well-dressed diners, their worlds separated from the sidewalk by glass that might as well have been walls for how impenetrable they felt. A group of young professionals spilled out of a bar, laughing about something that had happened at their office, their casual mention of bonuses and promotions representing amounts that would change Rachel's life, but apparently constituted ordinary compensation in their sphere. She kept her eyes forward and maintained steady pace, despite the urge to turn around and walk back to neighborhoods where she understood the rules and could predict outcomes with reasonable accuracy. The meter climbed higher than she'd anticipated, and she calculated mentally whether she'd have enough left for the ride home if dinner somehow went poorly. Her sister had insisted on lending her $40 for emergencies, pressing the bills into Rachel's hand with encouragement that felt both supportive and pitying. The city lights reflected off the harbor as they approached the restaurant district, beauty that existed primarily for people who could afford to purchase proximity to it. Harborview's entrance featured a doorman who assessed her appearance in one sweeping glance before deciding she merited basic courtesy, but nothing approaching warmth. Inside, the host checked his reservation list twice before confirming the booking, his expression suggesting confusion about how someone like her had secured a table. The dining room spread before her in a display of understated wealth, linen napkins folded into elaborate shapes and silverware that gleamed under artfully positioned lighting. Other diners watched her progress toward the table with the casual interest people show to anything that doesn't quite belong, their conversations pausing just long enough to register judgment. A woman in pearls leaned toward her companion and whispered something that prompted a knowing smile, the kind of interaction that communicated entire volumes about class and belonging. Rachel felt each step across the polished floor as a small act of defiance, continuing forward despite every signal that she should turn around and leave. The table for two sat near the window with a view of the harbor, boats bobbing in their slips like toys in a wealthy child's bathtub. Rachel smoothed her borrowed dress and sat carefully, hyper-aware of the oil stain on her sleeve that she'd tried unsuccessfully to hide with a cardigan. The waiter appeared immediately to offer water and explain the evening's specials in a tone that suggested he was reciting poetry to someone who couldn't appreciate it. She ordered nothing, explaining that she was waiting for her date, watching his expression shift to something between pity and amusement as he retreated. The water glass sweated condensation onto the white tablecloth, while she studied the menu to avoid making eye contact with anyone nearby. Minutes accumulated like small weights on her chest, each one adding to the growing certainty that something was wrong, that the careful hope she'd constructed was built on foundation designed to collapse. 10 minutes became 20 while Rachel checked her phone repeatedly, finding no messages or explanations for the delay. She told herself that traffic could be unpredictable, that emergencies happened, that she should give him more time before assuming the worst. The waiter circled past twice more, his patience visibly thinning as her presence occupied valuable real estate without generating revenue. Around her, the restaurant filled with the sounds of successful people enjoying expensive food, their laughter a soundtrack to her isolation. At 30 minutes, the couple at the next table began whispering behind their menus, stealing glances at Rachel with expressions that mixed sympathy and entertainment. The woman's eyes lingered on the oil stain with the kind of fascinated disgust people show toward things that confirm their assumptions about social hierarchies. Her companion smirked and said something too quiet for Rachel to hear, but clearly about her. Their shared amusement at her expense another layer of humiliation. Rachel's face burned, but she maintained her posture, spine straight, and hands folded calmly in her lap despite the trembling she couldn't quite control. She refused to give whoever had orchestrated this the satisfaction of watching her flee or cry, her pride the only possession she'd brought that couldn't be diminished by expensive surroundings. The borrowed dress felt like costume now. Her attempt at transformation revealed as naive belief that presentation could overcome the permanent markers of her actual life. The waiter returned at 40 minutes with barely concealed irritation, suggesting that perhaps her companion had been delayed, and she might prefer to wait at the bar. His tone made clear this was less suggestion than instruction, the restaurant's patience with her occupation of premium seating finally exhausted. Rachel nodded and began gathering her purse, preparing to complete her humiliation by relocating to a bar stool where she'd be less visible reminder of whatever had gone wrong. She signaled for the check, determined to pay for her water and leave with whatever dignity remained salvageable from the evening's wreckage. The waiter pulled a small leather folder from his apron, relief evident in his expression that this uncomfortable situation was finally resolving itself. Rachel opened her wallet and extracted bills, her hands steady now that the decision to leave had been made, the worst of it almost over. At that precise moment, the restaurant's entrance doors swung wide, admitting a gust of cool evening air and a presence that immediately altered the room's entire atmosphere. Vincent Moretti entered with his daughter Lucy, balanced on his hip, her small hands gripping his tailored jacket, while her curious eyes scanned the dining room with unfiltered interest. Every head turned toward them, not because children were unusual in such establishments, but because Vincent carried authority that preceded him like a change in air pressure. The maitre d' materialized at Vincent's side with deference that bordered on fear, offering the best table in the house despite the full reservation book visible on his podium. Vincent declined with a slight headshake, his eyes already scanning the room in the automatic threat assessment of someone who'd survived by never fully relaxing. Lucy squirmed in his arms and pointed toward the window where boats rocked gently in their slips, her 3-year-old voice cutting through the subdued atmosphere with demands to see the water up close right now. Rachel fumbled with her money as the waiter hovered, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to extract enough bills to cover the water and a reasonable tip. The humiliation sat heavy in her chest, making each breath feel inadequate. Every second in this restaurant, another layer of shame she'd carry home like unwanted baggage. She could feel the stares from nearby tables intensifying now that her date's absence had been confirmed by her attempt to pay and leave, their entertainment reaching its conclusion. Vincent settled Lucy into the chair beside him at their corner table and began the familiar negotiation about sitting still and using indoor voices that didn't carry across entire rooms. The child ignored him completely, her attention captured by something across the dining room that her father couldn't yet identify from his angle. She pointed with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of someone too young to understand social boundaries, or the weight her father's reputation carried in spaces like this. Lucy's small voice rang out clearly in a momentary lull in the restaurant's ambient noise, declaring that the sad lady by the window had the same kind of dirty hands as Tony who fixed their motorcycles. Every diner within earshot turned to follow Lucy's pointing finger, their gazes landing on Rachel with renewed interest that transformed her private shame into public spectacle. The woman in pearls actually laughed, a sharp sound quickly muffled behind her napkin, but unmistakably delighted by this new development. Rachel felt the weight of collective attention like physical pressure against her skin, dozens of eyes cataloging her inadequacies with the efficiency of people practiced at identifying who didn't belong in their spaces. The couple at the adjacent table had abandoned all pretense of discretion, openly staring while the man pulled out his phone to photograph, or perhaps record the scene unfolding. She recognized the performative cruelty of people who'd weaponize her humiliation on social media, turning her worst evening into entertainment for strangers who'd never consider how it felt to be reduced to content. The waiter who'd been hovering impatiently now froze completely, his earlier irritation replaced with calculation about whether intervening would help or worsen whatever was developing between his restaurant's most important patron and the woman everyone had been watching fail at maintaining dignity. The woman in pearls leaned so far toward her companion that Rachel could hear fragments of their whispered conversation. Words like embarrassing and desperate and what was she thinking floating across the space between tables with casual viciousness. Her companion's response included speculation about whether this was some kind of social experiment, or perhaps a reality show setup, his tone suggesting he found the entire situation amusing rather than uncomfortable. Rachel wanted to stand and leave, but Lucy's innocent declaration had temporarily paralyzed her capacity for decisive action. Her mind struggling to process why a child would be commenting on her hands in the middle of her carefully orchestrated public humiliation. The absurdity of having her working-class markers pointed out by a 3-year-old, while she sat abandoned at a table set for 2, felt like narrative flourish too heavy-handed for fiction. Yet here she was, living through it anyway. The restaurant's ambient noise had dropped to near silence as more diners became aware something interesting was happening, conversations trailing off while people oriented their attention toward the drama by the window. Rachel could feel their collective anticipation, the crowd's hunger for resolution that would either validate their assumptions about her or provide unexpected twist they could discuss later. A young woman at the bar had her phone raised and was clearly recording, her expression suggesting she was already composing the caption that would accompany this content when she posted it across whatever platform she favored. Rachel understood with sick certainty that her evening would be preserved digitally, that tomorrow people who'd never met her would watch her sit alone in borrowed clothes, while strangers judged her worthiness to occupy space in an expensive restaurant. The maître d' had appeared at the edge of Rachel's awareness, hovering near the kitchen entrance with expressions suggesting he was weighing options for managing situation that threatened to disrupt his carefully maintained atmosphere. His attention kept flickering between Rachel and whatever was happening at the corner table where the child's voice had originated, his professional mask slipping enough to reveal genuine uncertainty about protocol. Rachel realized that her presence had become problem-requiring solution, that she'd transformed from merely unwanted guest into active disruption that management would need to address. The awareness that she was about to be asked to leave cut through her paralysis with sharp clarity, anger finally beginning to surface beneath the layers of embarrassment she'd been drowning in for the past 40 minutes. The waiter returned to Rachel's table, moving with new purpose, the check folder clutched in his hand like shield, or possibly weapon, depending on how she chose to respond to what was clearly coming. His professional courtesy had evaporated completely, replaced with barely concealed eagerness to conclude this uncomfortable situation and reclaim his table for customers who would actually order food and tip appropriately. Rachel saw him open his mouth to deliver whatever script he'd prepared for evicting her, saw the exact moment when his gaze shifted past her shoulder and his expression transformed from determination to something approaching fear. The change was so dramatic that Rachel turned to see what had caused it, following his sightline toward the corner table where a man was rising from his seat with a small child in tow. The man's presence seemed to expand as he stood, something in his bearing communicating authority that had nothing to do with his expensive suit or the way other diners' attention immediately shifted away from Rachel toward him. The woman in pearls who'd been so entertained by Rachel's humiliation suddenly found her silverware fascinating, her companion becoming intensely focused on his wine glass as though it contained answers to questions he hadn't asked. The young woman at the bar lowered her phone rapidly, her recording apparently concluding abruptly now that someone more significant than a humiliated mechanic had entered the scene. Rachel watched this collective retreat with confusion, unclear why one man's decision to stand would cause such dramatic shift in the room's entire atmosphere and energy. The waiter froze mid-transaction, his expression shifting from impatience to uncertainty, as he registered the connection between the woman he'd been dismissing and the child of Vincent Moretti. His hand remained extended for Rachel's money, but his attention had pivoted completely toward the corner table, calculating new social mathematics that might affect his position. Rachel's face flushed deeper as she realized a small child was now participating in her public humiliation, innocent observation somehow worse than adult cruelty. Vincent followed his daughter's gesture and saw Rachel clearly for the first time, his trained eye immediately cataloging details that told a complete story. The borrowed dress that didn't quite fit, the oil stain poorly concealed by a cardigan, the desperate composure of someone enduring something painful but refusing to break. He recognized the signs of a setup with the instant clarity of someone who'd orchestrated similar scenarios for very different purposes, understanding the mechanics of public humiliation, like a native language. Lucy slipped from her chair before Vincent could prevent it, moving with the fearless confidence of a child who'd never learned that approaching strangers carried risks. She crossed the space between tables while her father rose to follow, her small legs carrying her directly toward Rachel with single-minded determination. Vincent caught up as Lucy arrived at Rachel's table, his hand settling gently on his daughter's shoulder in restraint that was both protective and apologetic. Rachel looked down at the child in complete confusion, her mind still processing the abrupt shift from preparing to leave to being approached by a little girl with soft brown curls. Lucy's bright smile cut through her embarrassment like unexpected sunlight through clouds, the simple directness of children who hadn't yet learned that some people weren't supposed to talk to others. Behind the child, Rachel saw a man in an expensive suit, his controlled movements and watchful eyes suggesting someone accustomed to command, his expression unreadable as he assessed the situation his daughter had created. Vincent's apology emerged in a low voice that carried undertones of authority despite its surface politeness, explaining that his daughter was still learning about personal space and appropriate behavior in public settings. His eyes met Rachel's with intensity that seemed to see past her embarrassment to something underneath, evaluation happening in seconds that would take others minutes. The waiter retreated rapidly, suddenly unwilling to complete a transaction that might displease Vincent Moretti, leaving Rachel holding her money with no clear destination for it. Lucy ignored her father's gentle attempt to guide her back to their table, instead climbing uninvited into the empty chair across from Rachel and announcing her desire to know about the dirty hands. She asked if Rachel fixed cars like Tony, who worked on their motorcycles, her enthusiasm genuine and uncontaminated by the social judgments that had filled the room minutes earlier. The question hung in the air while other diners watched with fascination, wondering how this unexpected intersection of worlds would resolve itself. Rachel found herself answering before she'd consciously decided to speak, explaining that yes, she was a mechanic, that the stain came from changing someone's oil filter that afternoon, and helping a single mother whose car had died in the grocery store parking lot. Lucy's face lit up with pure delight, and she began firing rapid questions about engines and tools, her interest so genuine that Rachel felt something loosen in her chest. For the first time since entering Harborview, she wasn't being judged or pitied, just seen by a child who cared only about the interesting nature of her work. Vincent observed the interaction with growing curiosity, noting how Rachel's defensive posture softened as she engaged with Lucy's questions without condescension or false enthusiasm. Most people who encountered his daughter in public either ignored her completely or offered the patronizing cheerfulness adults used with children they didn't actually like. Rachel spoke to Lucy like she was a person worth taking seriously, explaining how engine grease bonded with skin oils at a molecular level and never fully washed out no matter how much soap you used. The restaurant's atmosphere shifted subtly as Vincent remained at Rachel's table, other diners returning to their meals with studied casualness while maintaining peripheral awareness of the situation. The waiter reappeared to ask if everything was satisfactory, his earlier dismissiveness replaced with careful attention to Vincent's presence, an obvious desire to avoid any misstep that might register as disrespect. Rachel still held her money, uncertain whether she was supposed to pay or leave, or somehow extract herself from an interaction she didn't remotely understand. Lucy solved the problem by declaring loudly that Rachel should eat dinner with them because she was interesting and looked hungry, and it wasn't fair that she was sitting alone. Her child's logic bypassed every social complexity, reducing the situation to simple elements of kindness and inclusion that made sense in her uncomplicated worldview. Vincent's expression flickered with something that might have been amusement, as he considered whether to override his daughter's invitation, weighing factors that Rachel couldn't begin to guess at. The seconds stretched, while Rachel waited for Vincent to collect his child and leave her to finish her exit in relative peace, the brief interruption already fading into the evening's catalog of humiliations. Instead, Vincent asked quietly if she had somewhere else to be, if someone was expecting her, his tone making absolutely clear he'd already deduced the truth about her abandoned date. The question offered her an exit if she wanted it, but also extended genuine invitation if she chose to stay, the choice deliberately placed in her hands. Rachel heard herself accepting, before her rational mind could catalog all the reasonable objections that should have prevented her from dining with strangers, particularly strangers whose surname carried weight she didn't fully understand. Lucy cheered with uninhibited joy and immediately began suggesting menu items, pointing to pictures and describing elaborate preferences that seemed impossibly sophisticated for someone who still needed help cutting her food. The waiter appeared at Vincent's slight gesture, his entire demeanor transformed by the prospect of serving Moretti, rather than evicting an unwanted guest who'd overstayed her welcome. The waiter's hands trembled slightly as he took their order, addressing Vincent with exaggerated respect, while his eyes carefully avoided Rachel as though she'd become invisible through proximity to more important people. Lucy ordered pasta with butter, and absolutely nothing else, explaining seriously to Rachel that vegetables were acceptable in theory, but not in practice, especially not the green ones that tried to hide under cheese. Vincent ordered wine without consulting the list, naming a vintage that made the waiter's eyebrows rise before he hurried away to retrieve it from whatever temperature-controlled vault the restaurant maintained for its most expensive bottles. Rachel sat in surreal displacement, her abandoned date and public humiliation receding into background static against the strangeness of sharing a meal with the Moretti family. She'd heard Vincent's name before, whispered in her garage when certain customers came to have their luxury vehicles serviced with no questions asked about modifications or unusual compartments. The mechanics who'd worked in the city longer than Rachel had warned her to be polite if anyone connected to that name ever appeared, to fix whatever they brought quickly and efficiently, and forget what she'd seen. Lucy filled the silence with cheerful chatter about her day at preschool, describing conflicts over toy ownership and alliance shifts in the sandbox, with the seriousness of someone reporting on international diplomacy. She explained that Emma had broken the sharing agreement by giving the blue truck to James instead of Lucy, a betrayal that apparently violated some complex treaty Rachel couldn't quite follow. Vincent listened with patient attention, asking clarifying questions about which friend had done what and why the truck's color mattered so much, his focus on his daughter complete despite the way his eyes occasionally swept the room. The waiter produced menus with flourish that contrasted sharply with his earlier dismissive efficiency, opening Rachel's to a page featuring entrees whose prices she tried not to look at directly, for fear her expression would reveal her shock. Vincent ordered for Lucy without consulting the children's menu, requesting modifications to adult dishes that the waiter noted with careful attention, as though each detail carried weight beyond mere culinary preference. Rachel studied the menu with growing panic, unable to identify a single item she could afford, even with the money she'd brought for taxi fare, awareness dawning that she was trapped in a situation where refusing to order would be insulting, but ordering anything would exceed her financial capacity. Vincent seemed to sense her discomfort without her voicing it, and suggested the salmon, mentioning casually that it was excellent here, and that everything was on his account regardless, the statement delivered with enough certainty to forestall argument. The bread basket arrived with steam still rising from the cloth-wrapped rolls, accompanied by butter that had been molded into small rosettes and chilled to exactly the right consistency for spreading. Lucy immediately grabbed the largest piece and began dissecting it with her fingers, explaining to Rachel that you had to check bread carefully because sometimes restaurants hid things inside like raisins or nuts that could ruin everything. Vincent intercepted his daughter's increasingly destructive bread examination and demonstrated proper butter application, his movements precise enough to suggest either military training or obsessive personality that demanded order even in simple tasks. Rachel accepted her own role and found herself mimicking Vincent's careful method, hyper-aware that even something as basic as eating bread apparently had correct technique in places like this. Other diners had returned to their meals, but maintained peripheral awareness of Vincent's table, their attention less obvious now, but still present in occasional glances, and the way conversations near them stayed slightly quieter than tables farther across the room. Rachel noticed a man in an expensive suit at the bar watching them with expression she couldn't quite read, something in his stillness suggesting professional interest, rather than casual curiosity about why Moretti was dining with someone so obviously outside his usual social circle. Vincent's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, and he made brief eye contact with the man, some wordless communication passing between them that lasted only seconds before the observer returned his attention to his drink. The silent exchange reinforced Rachel's growing awareness that Vincent operated in contexts she didn't understand, with rules and hierarchies that remained invisible to people like her who existed completely outside those power structures. Lucy had finished her bread examination and declared it acceptable, though she'd created enough crumbs on the tablecloth to suggest a small explosion had occurred in front of her seat. She leaned toward Rachel conspiratorially and whispered loudly that her daddy always picked boring restaurants where kids had to be quiet and still, but Rachel seemed nice, so maybe it was okay this time. Vincent overheard this assessment and raised an eyebrow at his daughter, who responded with exaggerated innocence that fooled absolutely no one, but made Rachel laugh despite her lingering nervousness. The child's ability to diffuse tension through sheer force of personality was remarkable, her presence making it impossible for the evening to become too heavy or serious when she was constantly inserting observations about why forks had 4 points instead of 3. Rachel found herself relaxing incrementally, drawn into Lucy's narrative about the fundamental injustice of nap time when there were still puzzles incomplete and stories unfinished. The child's worldview reduced everything to simple principles of fairness and fun, untainted by the complicated calculations that governed adult interactions. Vincent's gentle corrections when Lucy's story grew too elaborate or strayed into obvious exaggeration showed practiced patience, the kind developed through repetition rather than natural temperament. The wine arrived in a bottle that probably cost more than Rachel's monthly rent, presented to Vincent for approval with ceremony that bordered on religious ritual. He tasted it with the economical precision of someone who'd been trained in such things from youth, nodding his acceptance without comment. When he poured for Rachel without asking her preference, the gesture managed to be both presumptuous and oddly thoughtful, filling her glass to exactly the right level for someone who might not be accustomed to wine this expensive. Rachel sipped carefully and tasted complexity that bloomed across her tongue, like proof of worlds she'd only ever observed from outside, flavors layering in ways she lacked vocabulary to describe. Lucy demanded a taste, and was denied with gentle firmness, Vincent explaining about adult drinks and child drinks with the patience of someone who'd had this exact conversation dozens of times. The child accepted the boundary with dramatic sighing that made Rachel smile despite herself, Lucy's theatrical disappointment somehow more genuine than adult sadness ever managed to be. Their food materialized with impressive speed, the kitchen clearly prioritizing Vincent's table over all others, regardless of who'd ordered first or been waiting longest. Lucy's pasta arrived in a bowl shaped like a boat, an accommodation the restaurant had made without being asked, suggesting they were prepared for the Moretti daughters' visits. Rachel's salmon sat on a plate that belonged in an art gallery, arranged with microgreens and sauce dots that formed a pattern too beautiful to disturb with a fork, each element placed with precision that seemed wasteful for something about to be eaten. Vincent ate with controlled efficiency, cutting his steak into exact portions and chewing thoroughly before speaking, his table manners betraying expensive upbringing, despite whatever reputation preceded him through the city. He asked Rachel about her work between bites, questions that demonstrated actual knowledge about automotive repair, rather than polite ignorance or patronizing curiosity. She found herself explaining her specialty in older engines, how modern computerized systems lacked the accessibility of carburetors and mechanical fuel injection, warming to her subject as she temporarily forgot the absurdity of dining with strangers. Lucy interrupted periodically with non-sequiturs about her pasta being too hot, or observations about other diners, her presence preventing the conversation from becoming too intense or revealing. She asked Rachel if she had children, accepting the negative answer with solemn nodding before declaring that Rachel should definitely get some, because they were fun most of the time, except when they weren't. Vincent's expression flickered with something that might have been amusement or pain, gone too quickly for Rachel to interpret with certainty, replaced immediately by his usual controlled neutrality. The meal progressed through courses with the inevitability of tide, dessert appearing without anyone ordering it. 3 plates of chocolate cake that Lucy attacked with focused determination. Rachel had stopped questioning the strangeness of the evening, surrendering to the temporary escape it provided from her earlier humiliation and the return to her small apartment that awaited afterward. The wine had softened the edges of her embarrassment, leaving her pleasantly disconnected from the woman who'd sat alone at this same table an hour earlier. Vincent mentioned casually that he collected vintage motorcycles, his tone carefully neutral, as he explained that his mechanic had recently retired and left him without reliable maintenance for his collection. The statement hung in the air, weighted with implication, an offer extended without being explicitly made, leaving Rachel space to ignore it if she chose. She responded that she'd worked on motorcycles before opening her automotive shop, that she actually preferred them to cars for their mechanical honesty and the way every component remained visible and accessible to someone who understood what they were seeing. Vincent's interest sharpened, and he asked specific questions about her experience with Italian bikes, naming models that Rachel knew were worth more than her entire garage and everything in it combined. She answered with technical confidence, explaining valve adjustment procedures and carburetor synchronization techniques that proved her expertise wasn't theoretical or exaggerated. The conversation shifted into genuine exchange between people who shared specialized knowledge, the class barriers that separated them temporarily irrelevant in the face of mechanical precision. Lucy had chocolate on her face and was fading visibly, her earlier energy depleted by the combination of rich food and staying up past her usual bedtime. She leaned against her father's arm and declared that Rachel was nice and should come to their house to see the motorcycles and maybe stay forever because they needed someone who understood about engines. Vincent wiped his daughter's face with his napkin, his movements gentle, and suggested it was time to leave, his tone making clear the evening was ending regardless of anyone's preference or Lucy's protests. The check never appeared, Vincent simply standing and lifting Lucy into his arms, while she protested sleepily that they hadn't said proper goodbye to their new friend. Rachel began to rise as well, uncertain of protocol for departing a meal she hadn't paid for with people she'd just met under the strangest circumstances of her life. Vincent told her to sit and finish her wine, that he'd already arranged for her taxi home to be charged to his account, the gesture both generous and controlling in ways Rachel didn't have energy to parse through wine-softened thoughts. He paused before leaving and mentioned the address of his estate outside the city, explaining that his collection was housed there, and if she wanted to assess the maintenance requirements, she should visit Tuesday afternoon around 2. Lucy waved enthusiastically from her father's shoulder, calling out that Rachel had to come because she'd promised, even though Rachel had made no such commitment. Then they were gone, leaving Rachel alone at the table, with half a glass of expensive wine, and complete confusion about what had just occurred and why. The restaurant's atmosphere shifted again with Vincent's departure, conversations rising to normal volume, and the waiter appearing to clear plates with his earlier dismissiveness restored, now that she was no longer under Moretti protection. Rachel sat in the space they'd vacated and tried to process the evening's trajectory from cruel prank to bizarre dinner with the city's most notorious family. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, containing just an address and a time, confirmation that Tuesday's invitation had been genuine, rather than the polite fiction she'd half expected it to be. Tuesday arrived with autumn rain that turned the city streets into mirrors reflecting gray sky, Rachel's truck splashing through puddles as she drove toward the address Vincent had sent. The estate sat 30 minutes outside the city limits where urban sprawl dissolved into rolling hills and properties measured in acres rather than square feet. She'd debated canceling a dozen times, inventing reasonable excuses for why a mechanic shouldn't visit a Mafia boss's home, but curiosity and the memory of Lucy's enthusiasm had overridden her survival instincts. The gate appeared suddenly, wrought iron set between stone pillars that had been standing longer than Rachel had been alive, a call box mounted discreetly to one side. She pressed the button and stated her name, the gate swinging open immediately, as though someone had been watching for her arrival. The driveway curved through manicured grounds that looked nothing like the wild scrubland surrounding her garage, trees planted in deliberate patterns that created beauty through human intervention rather than natural accident. The house revealed itself gradually as she rounded the final curve, stone and glass combining in architecture that managed to feel both fortress and home. Rachel parked her battered truck beside a Mercedes that probably cost more than she'd earn in 5 years, feeling suddenly foolish for coming here. Before she could reconsider, the front door opened, and Lucy burst out in rain boots and a yellow jacket, running toward Rachel's truck with arms outstretched and complete disregard for the puddles soaking her legs. Vincent followed at a more measured pace, holding an umbrella that he raised over Rachel as she climbed from her truck, and was immediately embraced by his enthusiastic daughter. Lucy chattered about how she'd been watching for Rachel all morning, how she'd told everyone at breakfast that the motorcycle lady was coming, how she'd picked out special cookies for them to share. Rachel found herself smiling despite her nervousness, the child's uncomplicated joy infectious in ways that bypassed adult anxiety about appropriate boundaries and social hierarchies. Vincent guided them inside through doors that opened into a foyer larger than Rachel's entire apartment, but the space felt warm rather than intimidating. Family photographs lined one wall, Lucy at various ages mixed with images of Vincent with people Rachel didn't recognize, the kind of casual documentation of life that suggested this was a home rather than a showpiece. Lucy insisted on giving Rachel a tour, dragging her by the hand through rooms that combined expensive furnishings with scattered toys, evidence of childhood existence preventing the house from becoming a museum. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and something baking, a woman in her 60s turning from the oven to greet them with the familiarity of someone who'd worked here long enough to be family. She introduced herself as Maria, and told Lucy to let their guest breathe before dragging her all over the house. Lucy ignored this advice completely, pulling Rachel toward the back doors and the property beyond where the real treasure apparently waited. The motorcycle collection occupied a climate-controlled building that had probably been stables once, the structure converted but retaining original character in exposed beams and stone walls. Vincent opened the doors, and Rachel stopped breathing for a moment, faced with machines that represented decades of automotive history, arranged like sculpture. A 1952 Vincent Black Shadow sat beside a Bro Superior, their chrome and leather preserved in pristine condition that suggested they were rarely ridden, objects of appreciation rather than utility. Lucy released Rachel's hand and ran to a smaller motorcycle near the back, explaining that this one was her favorite because it was red and had a stripe. Vincent explained it was a 1974 Ducati 750 Sport, the first bike he'd ever owned, purchased with money from his first legitimate business deal, and kept for sentimental reasons despite offers from collectors. Rachel approached it slowly, her professional eye already cataloging details of maintenance and noting areas where age showed despite careful preservation. She asked permission before touching anything, her fingers tracing the fuel line and checking the cable tension with automatic assessment born from years of practice. Vincent watched her work with interest that seemed genuine rather than polite, answering her technical questions about riding frequency and storage conditions. The Ducati needed carburetor cleaning and fresh fluids, minor work that would restore it to full functionality, but several other machines required more extensive attention that hadn't been addressed since his previous mechanic's retirement. Rachel lost herself in examination of the collection, moving from bike to bike with growing excitement as she identified models she'd only seen in magazines and manuals. A 1969 Honda CB750 sat next to a Moto Guzzi V7 Sport, each machine representing different philosophy of engineering and design. She explained to Lucy in simple terms how each motorcycle had different personality, some preferring smooth roads while others handled rough terrain better, anthropomorphizing the machines in ways that made the child giggle and ask which one was the nicest. Vincent offered her the job without ceremony, stating a monthly retainer that made Rachel's eyes widen and suggesting she could work on the collection at her own pace around her regular garage schedule. He mentioned casually that he'd made inquiries about her business, that people spoke well of her honesty and skill, that he valued competence above almost everything else. The background check he was admitting to should have felt invasive, but instead came across as practical caution from someone whose world required verification before trust. Rachel accepted with less hesitation than she'd expected, the opportunity to work on these machines outweighing her nervousness about Vincent's reputation and business dealings. Lucy celebrated by insisting they all have cookies immediately, leading them back toward the house with declarations that this was the best day ever. Maria had set out coffee and the promised cookies, Lucy climbing into a chair and patting the one beside her to indicate where Rachel should sit. They talked mechanics and motorcycles while Lucy colored at the table, the conversation flowing more easily than Rachel would have predicted between people from such different worlds. Vincent asked about her garage and how she'd gotten into automotive repair, listening with attention that felt rare in Rachel's experience of men, who usually assumed they knew more than she did. She explained about learning from her father who'd died when she was 19, leaving her his tools and his unfinished projects, how working with engines kept her connected to his memory. The afternoon dissolved into early evening, without Rachel noticing the passage of time, Lucy eventually falling asleep in her chair with her head on her arms, and crayons still clutched in one hand. Vincent lifted his daughter with practiced ease, excusing himself to put her down for a proper nap. Rachel stood to leave, but he suggested she stay for dinner, Maria already preparing something that smelled of garlic and herbs, the invitation extended with assumption of acceptance that felt more welcoming than presumptuous. Dinner happened in the kitchen rather than formal dining room, Maria joining them at the table with the ease of someone who'd earned her place in this household through years, rather than employment contract. The conversation ranged across topics that had nothing to do with motorcycles or mechanics. Vincent asking Rachel about books she'd read and places she'd traveled, revealing unexpected knowledge about poetry when she mentioned loving Mary Oliver. The man who ran illegal operations through the city quoted verses about wild geese and grasshoppers, his dangerous reputation sitting oddly beside literary sensibility. Lucy woke after an hour and appeared in the kitchen rubbing her eyes, climbing into her father's lap without asking permission, and studying Rachel with sleepy contentment. She announced that Rachel should come every Tuesday, and also maybe other days too, her logic simple and inarguable in her 3-year-old mind. Vincent explained gently that Rachel had her own work and life, that they couldn't monopolize all her time, but his daughter remained unconvinced by adult reasoning about schedules and obligations. Maria served pasta that tasted nothing like restaurant food, the kind of cooking that came from knowledge passed through generations rather than culinary school. Rachel found herself talking about her garage and the customers who became regulars, the single mothers whose cars she fixed at discount, and the elderly man who visited weekly just to tell stories about the vehicles he'd owned across his lifetime. Vincent listened without the impatience she'd learned to expect from wealthy people who couldn't understand why she'd charge less than maximum profit allowed. The evening shifted as Lucy became more alert, the child insisting on showing Rachel her room and her toys and her books, leading another tour through the house with fresh enthusiasm. Her bedroom looked like any little girl's space, pink walls and stuffed animals coexisting with toy cars and building blocks, evidence that Vincent didn't force his daughter into narrow definitions of appropriate interests. Lucy pulled out a photo album and began explaining each picture, her narrative wandering through family history that Rachel tried not to absorb too carefully. One photo showed Vincent younger and smiling beside a woman with Lucy's eyes and darker hair, their body language suggesting the happiness of early marriage before complications emerged. Lucy explained matter-of-factly that this was her mama who lived in the city and saw her on weekends, that her parents weren't married anymore but still liked each other mostly. The child's acceptance of her split family situation spoke to careful handling by adults who'd prioritized her well-being over their own conflicts. Rachel felt Vincent's presence in the doorway before she saw him, turning to find him watching his daughter with expression that mixed love and something heavier, perhaps guilt or grief for the intact family he couldn't provide. He suggested gently that it was getting late, and Rachel probably needed to head home, giving her an exit from the intimacy that had developed through the evening. Lucy protested, but accepted her father's decision with only token resistance, extracting a promise that Rachel would return next Tuesday. The walk to Rachel's truck happened under stars that were visible this far from the city's light pollution, the kind of sky she remembered from childhood before moving to town for work. Vincent carried a toolkit as a gift, expensive German tools that Rachel protested accepting until he explained they'd belonged to his previous mechanic, who'd left them in his will to whoever took over the collection's care. The gesture transformed the gift from charity to inheritance, making acceptance feel like honoring someone's wishes rather than accepting handouts. Rachel drove home with the toolkit on her passenger seat, and confusion about what was developing between her and the Moretti family. She'd gone expecting a simple job opportunity, and found something more complicated, connection forming in ways she didn't know how to categorize or resist. The evening had felt normal, despite occurring in anything but normal circumstances. Lucy's presence perhaps making it impossible for adult complications to dominate completely. Her phone buzzed as she pulled into her apartment complex, a message from Vincent thanking her for her patience with Lucy, and confirming next Tuesday's arrangement. The text included a separate message from Lucy dictated to her father, strings of emoji hearts and smiley faces that made Rachel laugh alone in her truck. She responded simply, thanking him for dinner and promising Lucy she'd return, aware she was committing to something that extended beyond professional obligation, into territory she couldn't map. Sleep came slowly that night, Rachel's mind replaying moments from the evening and trying to understand Vincent beyond his reputation. The man who quoted poetry and tenderly carried his sleeping daughter matched poorly with stories whispered about Moretti business dealings and disappeared rivals. She wondered if people were more complicated than their reputation suggested, or if she was being naive about dangers she couldn't see clearly from her position outside his world. Tuesday became routine over the following weeks, Rachel arriving at the estate to work on the motorcycle collection, while Lucy orbited her progress with questions and commentary. The child appointed herself assistant mechanic, fetching tools with serious concentration and offering suggestions that showed she'd been absorbing Rachel's explanations about how engines worked. Vincent often joined them in the garage, content to watch and occasionally help with tasks requiring extra hands, their conversations flowing easily around Lucy's interruptions. Maria began packing extra food for Rachel to take home, ignoring protest that she didn't need charity with the calm certainty of someone who'd made up her mind about something. The housekeeper explained that she'd raised Vincent from childhood, that she knew his character better than the people who spread rumors about his business, that Rachel was good for him and Lucy in ways that had nothing to do with motorcycles. The endorsement felt significant coming from someone with no reason to mislead or manipulate. The garage work revealed itself as excuse more than necessity, the motorcycles requiring less maintenance than the arrangement suggested. Rachel understood she was being paid generously for companionship as much as mechanical skill, that Vincent valued her presence for reasons extending beyond the condition of his collection. The realization should have bothered her, but instead felt honest, acknowledgement of connection forming between them that neither had explicitly named or defined. Lucy began asking when Rachel would stay for a sleepover, her child's logic unable to understand why someone she liked wouldn't just live with them permanently. Vincent deflected these questions with practiced patience, but Rachel noticed he never actually disagreed with his daughter's assessment. never explained that Rachel had her own life separate from theirs. The omission felt deliberate, leaving space for possibility he wasn't ready to articulate, but perhaps hoped might develop naturally. The shift happened on a Tuesday afternoon, 6 weeks into the arrangement, Rachel under the Ducati checking the exhaust system when she heard an unfamiliar car approaching up the drive. She emerged from beneath the motorcycle to find a sleek Audi parking beside Vincent's Mercedes, a woman climbing out who carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to admiration. Lucy looked up from her coloring book, and her expression transformed from concentration to complicated emotion that seemed too mature for her age. The woman approached with purpose, her designer clothes and perfect hair marking her as belonging to Vincent's world in ways Rachel's oil-stained work clothes never would. She swept past Rachel without acknowledgement, calling for Lucy, who'd stood from her spot on the garage floor. The child went to her mother with less enthusiasm than Rachel had expected, submitting to the embrace but not returning it with her usual physical affection. Vincent appeared from the house moving faster than Rachel had seen him move, his controlled calm cracking enough to show tension underneath. He greeted the woman with careful courtesy, addressing her as Elise, and asking what brought her here midweek when their custody schedule clearly indicated weekend visits. Elise ignored his question, and instead turned her attention to Rachel for the first time, her expression calculating as she assessed the mechanic who'd been spending time with her daughter. The accusation emerged sharp and direct, Elise demanding to know who Rachel thought she was inserting herself into Lucy's life without permission or background check. Her voice carried contempt that reduced Rachel to exactly what she appeared on surface, working-class woman with no business in this family's complicated dynamics. Rachel stepped back instinctively, unwilling to engage in conflict she didn't understand. But Lucy surprised everyone by moving to stand beside Rachel and declaring that she liked her and wanted her there. Vincent's expression hardened as he explained coldly that Rachel was his employee and guest, that Elise had no authority over who visited his home during his custody time. The conversation escalated quickly into coded references to past arguments, their history revealing itself through shortcuts and implications that excluded Rachel from full understanding. Elise mentioned concerns about appropriate influences and Lucy's exposure to people without proper background, her meaning clear, even through diplomatic phrasing. Rachel felt herself shrinking under scrutiny that reduced her to symbol of everything Elise feared about Vincent's world, the dangerous associations and poor judgment that might contaminate their daughter. She offered to leave and give them privacy to discuss whatever needed discussing, but Vincent's hand on her shoulder stopped her retreat. He told Elise that she was welcome to discuss concerns through their lawyers, but that she didn't get to show up unannounced and attack his guests, his voice carrying edge that reminded Rachel exactly who she was dealing with. Elise's composure cracked slightly, and she revealed the real source of her concern, that mutual friends had seen Vincent and Rachel at Harborview, that people were talking about the mechanic who'd somehow captured Moretti's interest. The vulnerability underneath her anger became visible, fear that she was being replaced in Lucy's affection by someone she considered unworthy of the position. Rachel understood suddenly that this wasn't about her specifically, but about Elise's complicated feelings regarding her ex-husband and their failed marriage. Lucy began crying, overwhelmed by adult emotions she couldn't process or understand, asking why everyone was fighting when Rachel was nice and hadn't done anything wrong. Vincent lifted his daughter and spoke to her quietly, explaining that adults sometimes disagreed about things, but that it would be okay, that everyone here loved her very much. The child buried her face in his shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs that seemed to drain the hostility from the moment. Elise's expression shifted as she watched Vincent comfort their daughter, something in her face softening toward genuine concern rather than territorial anger. She approached Rachel directly and apologized stiffly for her rudeness, explaining that she worried about Lucy's well-being constantly, and sometimes that worry expressed itself poorly. Rachel accepted the apology with quiet dignity, understanding that fear motivated the attack more than actual malice toward someone Elise didn't even know. Vincent suggested they move this conversation inside, where Maria could watch Lucy while the adults talked properly without audience. He guided them toward the house with hand still on Rachel's shoulder, the gesture both protective and possessive in ways she wasn't sure he intended. Maria appeared at the door and took Lucy inside with soothing words, leaving the three adults standing in uncomfortable triangle on the driveway. The discussion that followed happened in Vincent's study, Elise explaining her concerns about Lucy's attachment to Rachel and what would happen when the mechanic inevitably left their lives. She pointed out that Rachel had her own separate existence, that whatever arrangement Vincent had made would eventually end. and Lucy would face another loss after already processing her parents' divorce. The argument held logic that Rachel couldn't entirely dismiss, awareness that she'd become entangled in this child's life without considering long-term implications. Vincent listened without interruption until Elise finished, then asked quietly if she'd ever known him to be careless with their daughter's emotional well-being. He explained that Rachel's presence had brought joy to Lucy's life that had been missing since the divorce, that his daughter smiled more and talked more and seemed more secure than she had in months. Whatever was developing between him and Rachel would proceed carefully with Lucy's best interests paramount, not abandoned at first sign of complication. Rachel heard herself described as part of Vincent's future plans and felt something shift in her chest, realization hitting that he'd been thinking about this more seriously than she'd understood. Elise seemed to recognize the same thing, her expression moving through surprise toward resignation. She asked Rachel directly if she understood what she was getting into with Vincent, if she knew about his business and the complications that came with his particular life. The moment demanded honesty that Rachel hadn't fully articulated even to herself, but she answered that she knew enough and was choosing to continue anyway. She explained that Lucy had become important to her in ways that transcended the job arrangement, that walking away to protect herself would hurt the child they were all claiming to prioritize. Elise studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. Acceptance, if not enthusiasm. Acknowledgement that Rachel's intentions at least seemed genuine. Elise left an hour later with promises to maintain scheduled custody arrangements and to give Rachel's presence in Lucy's life a chance to prove itself beneficial rather than harmful. The tension in Vincent's shoulders eased visibly as her car disappeared down the driveway, his carefully maintained composure cracking enough to reveal the strain of managing explosive situation without losing control. Rachel stood beside him in uncertain silence, aware that something fundamental had shifted in their arrangement, but unclear what that meant for her continued involvement with this family. Lucy emerged from the house where Maria had distracted her with cookie decorating, chocolate on her face and relief in her expression when she saw all the adults still present and apparently calm. She ran to Rachel first rather than her father, wrapping small arms around the mechanic's legs and asking if everyone had stopped being mad now. Rachel assured her that everything was fine, that grown-ups sometimes needed to talk about complicated things, but that nothing had changed about their Tuesday arrangement. Vincent watched this interaction with expression that Rachel couldn't quite read, something in his eyes suggesting he was re-evaluating decisions, or perhaps confirming conclusions he'd already reached. He suggested they postpone the rest of the day's mechanical work, that Lucy had been through enough stress and needed comfort more than she needed to watch carburetor maintenance. Rachel agreed immediately, recognizing that her continued presence might provide stability for a child who'd just witnessed conflict between the adults in her world. They spent the remainder of the afternoon in Lucy's playroom, the child orchestrating elaborate scenarios with her toy cars and demanding Rachel and Vincent both participate in narratives that made sense only to 3-year-old logic. The normalcy of play seemed to restore Lucy's equilibrium, her earlier distress fading as she directed them through adventures involving talking motorcycles and cars that could fly. Vincent threw himself into the pretend with surprising commitment, providing voices for different vehicles, and accepting Lucy's corrections when he deviated from her vision. Maria called them for early dinner, comfort food that felt appropriate for the day's emotional weather, and Lucy insisted Rachel sit in what was apparently becoming her usual chair. The conversation stayed deliberately light, avoiding any reference to Elise's visit, or the tensions it had exposed. Lucy described in detail a butterfly she'd seen that morning, her description growing more elaborate with each telling, until the insect had achieved nearly mythical proportions that made the adults exchange amused glances. After dinner, Vincent asked Rachel to stay while he put Lucy to bed, suggesting they needed to talk once his daughter was asleep. The request carried weight that made Rachel's stomach tighten with anxiety about what conversation would follow, whether he'd decided her presence caused too much complication for the benefit it provided. She waited in the living room while bedtime rituals happened upstairs, Lucy's voice drifting down as she demanded extra stories, and negotiated for just 5 more minutes of being awake. Vincent returned 40 minutes later carrying 2 glasses of whiskey, handing one to Rachel before settling into the chair across from her, with visible exhaustion. He thanked her for staying calm during Elise's confrontation, for not responding with anger or defensiveness that would have escalated the situation beyond management. Rachel deflected the gratitude by pointing out she'd been too confused to respond effectively anyway, that she still didn't fully understand what had happened, or what Elise thought was developing between them. The question hung in the air between them. invitation for Vincent to clarify exactly what their arrangement had become beyond employer and mechanic. He sipped his whiskey and seemed to choose his words carefully, explaining that he hadn't planned for any of this when he'd invited a stranger to share their table at Harborview. Lucy had precipitated their initial connection with her usual lack of social boundaries, but what had developed since was something Vincent hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely sure how to navigate. He admitted that his world came with complications that most people sensibly avoided, that his business dealings existed in gray areas that law enforcement monitored without being able to prove anything actionable. Rachel would be connected to those complications by association if their relationship continued beyond professional arrangement, subject to scrutiny and possible danger that came from proximity to someone with his reputation. The warning felt like test, opportunity for her to retreat with dignity before becoming more entangled in circumstances she didn't fully understand. Rachel asked the question that had been forming since she'd first learned his full name, whether he'd ever directly hurt someone who didn't deserve it, whether innocent people had suffered because of his business decisions. Vincent held her gaze and answered with honesty that felt dangerous in its completeness, explaining that he'd done things she wouldn't approve of, but never to people who hadn't chosen to enter his world. His operations targeted other criminals and corrupt systems, not families or civilians who wanted nothing to do with that existence. The distinction mattered to Rachel in ways she wasn't entirely proud of, but she recognized her own moral flexibility was revealing itself in real time. She wasn't walking away despite understanding more clearly what Vincent's life entailed, wasn't demanding he choose between his daughter and his business. Instead, she heard herself saying she wanted to continue their arrangement, that Lucy had become too important for her to abandon over abstract concerns about activities she'd never witnessed directly. Vincent's expression shifted into something that might have been relief, or possibly concern that she was making foolish choice, but he didn't try to talk her out of the decision she'd just articulated. He mentioned that continuing would require certain practical arrangements, that she'd need to be more careful about her own security and aware of her surroundings in ways most people didn't bother with. Rachel nodded acceptance of parameters she didn't fully grasp, trusting that Vincent would explain what she needed to know when she needed to know it. The conversation evolved into discussion of how their relationship would progress, whether they were acknowledging romantic interest or maintaining professional boundaries with friendship attached. Vincent admitted he'd been attracted to her since watching her speak to Lucy without condescension at Harborview, that competence and kindness combined in ways he found compelling. Rachel confessed she'd been fighting attraction she'd told herself was inappropriate, given their different circumstances, that she'd assumed he viewed her as convenient company rather than genuine romantic possibility. They agreed to proceed slowly for Lucy's sake, to let whatever was developing between them unfold naturally, rather than forcing definition or timeline. Vincent walked Rachel to her truck eventually, the night air cold enough to see their breath, and kissed her with careful intention that communicated interest without demanding immediate response. Rachel drove home tasting whiskey and possibility, aware she'd just committed to future. She couldn't predict with man. She probably shouldn't trust, but somehow did anyway. The following weeks established new rhythm that incorporated Rachel more fully into the Moretti household routine, her Tuesday visits extending into occasional weeknight dinners and weekend activities with Lucy. The child bloomed under the attention of two adults who clearly cared for her, her earlier anxiety about parental conflict fading as she adapted to expanded family structure. Elise maintained cordial distance during custody exchanges, civil if not warm, apparently satisfied that Rachel's influence wasn't harmful to their daughter's development. Vincent's business remained mostly invisible to Rachel. Occasional phone calls he'd take in another room or meetings that required him to leave her and Maria supervising Lucy. She didn't ask questions about what those conversations or meetings entailed, accepting that ignorance provided protection for both of them. The arrangement felt sustainable in ways she hadn't expected, her life expanding to accommodate this family without requiring her to abandon her own identity or work. Rachel's garage began receiving referrals from Vincent's associates, luxury vehicles appearing for maintenance with drivers who paid in cash and never questioned her invoices. The additional income allowed her to hire an assistant mechanic and upgrade equipment she'd been making do without, her business growing in direct correlation to her relationship with Vincent. She recognized the connection, but didn't examine it too closely, telling herself that competent work rather than favoritism explained the new clientele even as she understood that distinction was probably fiction, she told herself for comfort. 3 months into their relationship, Rachel met Vincent's mother at a Sunday dinner that felt deliberately designed as evaluation rather than casual meal. Elena Moretti studied Rachel with sharp eyes that assessed everything from her posture to how she interacted with Lucy, asking questions that seemed innocuous but clearly served deeper investigative purpose. The older woman had built the family business alongside her late husband, Vincent had explained beforehand, and her approval mattered more than any other authority figure in his world. Lucy's affection for Rachel apparently carried significant weight in Elena's assessment, the child's unself-conscious displays of attachment, providing testimony that needed no verbal elaboration. When Lucy insisted Rachel sit beside her and help cut her meat, when she shared her dessert without being asked, when she fell asleep against Rachel's shoulder after dinner, Elena's expression softened incrementally. The older woman pulled Rachel aside before she left, and said simply that Lucy needed stability, and anyone who provided that earned Moretti family protection, the statement both blessing and warning about expectations that came with inclusion. Rachel's apartment began to feel like way station rather than home, most of her time spent either at her garage or the estate where she kept spare clothes and toiletries in the guest room Vincent had designated as hers. Lucy started asking when Rachel would just live with them permanently, her 3-year-old logic unable to understand why someone present most days maintained separate residence. Vincent never answered these questions directly, but Rachel noticed he didn't discourage them either, allowing his daughter's assumptions to create pressure neither adult was quite ready to address explicitly. The mechanics of blending their lives revealed themselves through small accommodations and adjustments, Rachel learning which of Lucy's behaviors signaled genuine distress versus manipulation, Vincent discovering Rachel's tendency to skip meals when focused on work and ensuring food appeared at regular intervals. Maria treated Rachel's increasing presence as inevitable development she'd apparently predicted, adding Rachel's preferences to her mental catalog of household requirements, without commentary or judgment about the changing family structure. Winter arrived and brought holidays that required navigation of custody schedules and family obligations, Elise agreeing to alternate arrangements that gave both parents time with Lucy. Rachel spent Christmas morning at the estate watching Lucy demolish wrapping paper with gleeful abandon, the child's delight in a toy motorcycle garage suggesting Vincent had consulted Rachel about appropriate gifts. The domesticity of the scene struck Rachel as surreal even as she participated fully, her life transformed in less than 6 months from solitary mechanic to de facto stepmother. Vincent gave Rachel a gift that demonstrated attention to details she hadn't realized he'd noticed, a first edition of Mary Oliver's poems, with inscription about finding family in unexpected places. She'd given him leather gloves for writing, practical gift that acknowledged their shared interest while avoiding presumption of deeper meaning. Lucy gave Rachel a drawing of 3 people holding hands, the figures labeled in careful preschool letters as Daddy, Lucy, and Rachel, the child's vision of her family unit rendered in crayon and hope. The new year brought discussion about formalizing Rachel's position in Lucy's life, Vincent mentioning that legal arrangements could protect everyone's interests if Rachel was committed to permanent involvement. The conversation happened late at night after Lucy's bedtime, both of them tired, and maybe that exhaustion lowered usual defenses. Rachel admitted she couldn't imagine her life without Lucy now, that walking away would hurt her as much as it would hurt the child, that she understood she was essentially proposing to commit to both Morettis, even if traditional marriage wasn't immediately under discussion. Vincent's business experienced some unspecified conflict that brought increased security to the estate, guards appearing at the gate and accompanying Lucy's movements with heightened vigilance. Rachel wasn't told details, but understood something dangerous was happening in Vincent's other world, threats serious enough to warrant visible protection for his family. She found herself included in those protection protocols. Her truck followed discreetly when she drove to her garage, her apartment checked regularly by people she never saw, but whose presence Vincent confirmed. The danger felt abstract until Rachel found her garage vandalized one morning, tools scattered and equipment damaged in destruction that communicated message rather than random violence. Vincent arrived within minutes of her call, his expression cold, in ways she hadn't seen directed toward her vicinity before. He explained that someone was trying to leverage her against him, that attacking what he cared about was standard tactic in conflicts between organizations, that she needed to stay at the estate until the situation resolved itself through channels she shouldn't know about. Lucy sensed the tension despite adult efforts to maintain normalcy, becoming clingy and tearful in ways that broke Rachel's heart. The child asked repeatedly if Rachel was leaving, if the bad people would hurt her, questions that revealed she understood more about her father's world than anyone had realized. Vincent and Rachel both reassured her with promises they hoped they could keep, their shared concern for Lucy's emotional state becoming foundation for decisions about how to proceed with their relationship, and the complications it had inherited. Rachel moved into the estate officially, her apartment lease terminated, and possessions absorbed into Vincent's home with efficiency that suggested this had been inevitable rather than crisis response. Her garage remained open with her assistant managing daily operations while she worked primarily on Vincent's collection and accepted only select outside clients. The adjustment felt less dramatic than she'd anticipated, perhaps because she'd been gradually inhabiting this life for months already. The official transition merely acknowledging reality that had already developed. Elena visited more frequently, her presence providing additional security through reputation as much as physical protection. The older woman taught Rachel things about Vincent's world without explicitly naming what she was teaching, lessons about situational awareness and reading people's intentions and understanding when to ask questions versus when to stay silent. Rachel absorbed this education alongside learning Lucy's bedtime preferences and Vincent's coffee habits, her life becoming comprehensive immersion in Moretti family culture. The conflict that had triggered heightened security resolved through methods Rachel didn't ask about, Vincent's tension gradually easing and guards becoming less visible though not absent. Life returned to approximate normalcy with new baseline that included Rachel's permanent presence. Lucy's joy at this development, evident in her renewed energy and confidence. The child started telling people at preschool about her family of 3, her narrative including Rachel. With same certainty she included her father, the truth of their bond not requiring legal documentation to feel real. Vincent proposed on a Tuesday evening in the motorcycle garage where they'd first connected, Lucy presenting the ring with solemn importance and asking if this meant Rachel was officially her mother now. The ring was beautiful, but not ostentatious. Diamonds set in platinum with inscription inside about unexpected grace. Rachel said yes while covered in engine grease with oil in her hair, Lucy cheering and Vincent kissing her with relief that suggested he'd genuinely been uncertain of her answer, despite months of evidence pointing toward this conclusion. The engagement party happened at the estate with attendance from Vincent's business associates and legitimate friends, the mixture of worlds creating atmosphere that would have seemed impossible to Rachel a year earlier. Elena toasted the couple with words about family being chosen rather than only inherited, her approval cementing Rachel's position in ways that mattered beyond romantic relationship. Lucy served as unofficial hostess, introducing Rachel to guests as her almost mother with pride that made several hard men's expressions soften unexpectedly. Elise attended briefly, bringing a gift and offering congratulations that seemed genuine, if complicated by her own feelings about her ex-husband's new life. She pulled Rachel aside to thank her for being good to Lucy, for not trying to replace her in their daughter's heart, but instead expanding the circle of people who loved the child. The conversation felt like final acceptance, acknowledgement that their family structure might be unconventional, but was working for everyone involved, especially the little girl at the center of it all. Plans for a small wedding began taking shape, Lucy insisting on being flower girl and having extensive opinions about dress colors and flower choices. Vincent let his daughter direct most decisions, his primary concern being that Rachel was happy, and Lucy felt included in creating their official family unit. Rachel found herself planning a future she couldn't have imagined when she'd walked into Harborview for a date that never arrived, grateful for the cruelty that had inadvertently led her to this unexpected family. The wedding happened in early spring in the estate's garden, cherry blossoms providing canopy for ceremony attended by carefully selected group that represented both Vincent's worlds. Lucy took her role seriously, scattering petals with concentrated precision and standing between Vincent and Rachel during vows. The officiant acknowledged the unique family they were forming, 3 people committing to each other rather than traditional dyad. Lucy's importance to the marriage recognized explicitly in the ceremony structure. Rachel wore a simple dress that allowed her to move comfortably and didn't require constant adjustment, her practical nature asserting itself even in wedding attire. Lucy's dress matched in color, the child's insistence that they coordinate honored by Vincent, who'd learned to pick his battles with his determined daughter. Elena cried quietly in the front row, her husband's absence acknowledged through empty chair beside her, the family legacy continuing through Vincent's unlikely choice of partner. The reception transformed the estate into celebration space, music and food and people who'd learned to coexist across different segments of Vincent's life. Rachel danced with her new husband, while Lucy insisted on joining them, the 3 of them moving together in approximation of grace that made guests smile. Elena gave a speech about unexpected blessings, and the family's tradition of choosing partners with strength to match their own, her words elevating Rachel's background rather than dismissing it. Elise arrived for the final hour with a gift for Lucy, a locket containing photos of both her mothers, so she could carry them both always. The gesture moved Rachel unexpectedly. Recognition that Elise was actively supporting Lucy's expanded family despite her own complicated feelings. They spoke briefly about custody schedules and Lucy's transition to kindergarten, their conversation civil and focused on the child they both loved. Whatever past tensions dissolved into shared priority. Lucy fell asleep during the reception in Rachel's arms, exhausted from excitement and secure enough to rest wherever she landed. Vincent found them like that and stopped to simply watch for a moment, his expression revealing the peace he'd found in this unexpected family configuration. Rachel met his eyes over their daughter's head and smiled, understanding passing between them that needed no verbal expression. The honeymoon was delayed because neither Vincent nor Rachel wanted to leave Lucy, their family unit too new and precious to separate even briefly. Instead, they took a week at the estate with Maria handling everything, while the three of them existed in bubble of family time. Lucy delighted in having both parents completely present without competing obligations, her happiness the clearest indicator that they'd made right choices, despite unconventional path that had led them here. Rachel's garage thrived under her assistant's management, but she found herself less interested in returning to full-time work outside the estate. Her priorities shifted by family responsibilities and the satisfaction of maintaining Vincent's collection. She taught Lucy basic mechanical principles using toy engines Vincent had acquired for this purpose, the child's interest genuine and her aptitude surprising. The thought of eventually teaching Lucy to ride motorcycles felt simultaneously terrifying and perfect, continuation of the connection that had begun in a restaurant when a 3-year-old had asked about dirty hands. Vincent's business continued in its usual patterns, but his participation became more selective, delegating more to trusted associates so he could prioritize family time. Elena approved this transition and began grooming younger family members for leadership roles, the organization's future secured without requiring Vincent's constant attention. Rachel never became involved in the business directly, but her presence influenced Vincent's decisions, his choices reflecting concern for maintaining the life they'd built together. The community center where they'd launched the automotive education program began expanding into other practical skills training, Rachel's success demonstrating that young people responded to instruction that connected directly to employability and independence. She recruited other tradespeople from her network to teach plumbing basics and electrical work fundamentals, creating curriculum that demystified skilled trades for teenagers who'd been tracked toward college as though it were the only path to dignity. Vincent provided funding without seeking recognition, his contribution laundered through charitable foundations that kept his name distant from public-facing aspects of programs that genuinely helped people. Rachel understood this separation was necessary given the source of the money, but privately she appreciated that Vincent's complicated empire at least produced some unambiguous good that benefited families who'd never know the Moretti name or understand where their opportunities originated. Lucy's growing awareness of her father's reputation created new challenges as she began understanding that other children's parents sometimes reacted to the Moretti name with expressions she couldn't interpret, but recognized as different. She asked Vincent directly one evening why Emma's mother had gotten weird when she'd invited Emma for a playdate, her child's directness forcing conversation he'd been hoping to delay until she was older. Rachel sat beside him while he explained in age-appropriate terms that some people made judgments based on stories they'd heard rather than actual experience, that the Moretti name carried history that wasn't always fair, but was real nonetheless. Lucy processed this information with the seriousness of someone learning that the world contained complexities her previous understanding hadn't accommodated, her questions revealing she was developing awareness that would eventually require more complete explanations than they were providing now. The balance between protecting Lucy's innocence and preparing her for the reality of her family's position became ongoing negotiation that Rachel and Vincent revisited regularly as she matured. They decided together that honesty served her better than fantasy, that age-appropriate truth would give her tools to navigate a world that would always see her through the lens of her father's reputation. Rachel's presence in these conversations brought perspective Vincent valued, her outsider status providing clarity about how normal people perceived the Moretti name, and what Lucy would face as she moved through spaces where that name preceded her. Elise participated in these discussions during their increasingly frequent co-parenting meetings. The three adults united in determination to raise Lucy with enough self-awareness to protect herself without developing shame about her family. Rachel's garage had evolved into something beyond simple automotive repair, becoming hub for young people interested in trades and older mechanics who appreciated working environment that valued skill over credentials. She'd hired 2 more mechanics and an office manager, her business growing beyond what she could manage alone while maintaining her teaching schedule and family responsibilities. The expansion felt both exciting and slightly terrifying. Success carrying obligations she hadn't fully anticipated when she'd been working alone with rented tools and more ambition than capital. Vincent offered business advice when she asked, but respected her need to build something that belonged to her, rather than existing as extension of his resources and influence. The anniversary of their meeting at Harborview arrived, and Vincent surprised Rachel by reserving the same table where she'd sat alone waiting for a date that never came. The gesture both romantic and slightly painful in its reminder of that evening's humiliation. They brought Lucy, who listened with fascination to the story of how they'd met, her child's perspective finding nothing strange about the fact that her family had begun with a cruel prank, and her own innocent observation about dirty hands. The waiter who'd been dismissive to Rachel that first night had been replaced, but the new server treated them with respect that had nothing to do with Vincent's reputation, and everything to do with how they treated him in return. Small victory that mattered more to Rachel than she would have predicted. Elena's health had stabilized enough to allow her to attend Lucy's kindergarten graduation, the older woman insisting on being present for family milestones, despite her doctor's recommendations about limiting activity. She'd told Rachel privately that she'd lived long enough to see Vincent build something good, that knowing he had partners strong enough to stand beside him gave her peace about stepping back from active involvement in family business. The conversation had felt like blessing and burden simultaneously, Elena's confidence in Rachel's strength also acknowledging the challenges that would come with being Moretti matriarch when Elena eventually passed. Rachel wasn't sure she was ready for that responsibility, but understood readiness might not be prerequisite, that life demanded we grow into roles whether we felt prepared or not. Lucy started kindergarten with confidence born from secure home environment, her teachers noting her leadership qualities and tendency to include children others overlooked. She talked constantly about her family, showing photos of her mothers and father with pride that suggested no confusion about how her situation differed from classmates. When asked about having 2 mothers, Lucy explained simply that she was lucky to have extra people who loved her, her child's wisdom cutting through adult complications about family structure. The first year of marriage established rhythms and patterns that worked for their specific family configuration, flexibility built into every arrangement to accommodate Lucy's needs, and the reality that they were building something without clear template. Rachel and Vincent learned each other's boundaries and triggers, their communication improving through necessity and genuine desire to make their partnership work. Lucy flourished in an environment where she felt secure and valued, her earlier anxiety about abandonment fading as consistent presence of her parents provided foundation she needed. Elena's health began declining, her age and lifetime of stress catching up, despite her determination to remain formidable. She spent more time at the estate with Vincent and his family, Lucy bringing her great-grandmother joy that seemed to ease her physical discomfort. Rachel sat with Elena during quiet afternoons, while Lucy napped, listening to stories about Vincent's childhood and the family's history, understanding being entrusted with legacy that would become her responsibility to carry forward. The community center where Lucy attended after-school programs needed funding, and Rachel suggested Vincent sponsor youth automotive education, teaching basic mechanics to children whose families couldn't afford professional repairs. The program launched with Rachel as primary instructor, her garage skills finally finding application beyond personal business. Vincent provided space and equipment while maintaining distance from public-facing aspects, his contribution acknowledged privately, while Rachel's name appeared on program materials. Lucy helped teach the community classes, demonstrating for other children and explaining concepts with patience learned from watching Rachel work. The program served families from Rachel's old neighborhood, giving her opportunity to give back to community that had supported her garage during difficult early years. Vincent watched his wife teach without seeking recognition or status, her contentment in useful work confirming what he'd recognized at Harborview years earlier about her character. The autumn after their wedding brought Rachel's 30th birthday, and with it reflection on how completely her life had transformed. She thought about the woman who'd sat alone at Harborview, waiting for a date who'd never existed, how humiliation had led to everything good in her current life. Lucy made her a card with drawing of their family that now included Elise when appropriate, Maria in many pictures, and Elena prominently featured, the child's understanding of family expansive and inclusive. Vincent gave Rachel a vintage motorcycle she'd mentioned admiring once, the kind of gift that acknowledged their shared passion while celebrating her specifically. They rode together on autumn afternoons while Lucy stayed with Maria, the freedom of movement and wind and speed, providing escape from daily responsibilities. These rides became their private time, space to remember who they'd been individually before becoming partners and parents, maintaining connection that existed separate from their roles in Lucy's life. The year closed with holiday celebrations that felt established rather than experimental, their family traditions solidifying through repetition and shared history. Lucy asked Santa for a baby sibling, her request making both Rachel and Vincent laugh while privately discussing whether they wanted to expand their family further. The conversation remained open-ended, but the fact they were having it at all demonstrated how secure their foundation had become, how the impossible family created through accident and choice had proven itself sustainable and real. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you stories about unexpected families, second chances, and the beautiful ways love finds us when we least expect it. Remember that kindness opens doors we didn't know existed, and sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as public humiliation at expensive restaurants.
А все равно, сути дела не меняет, зарплата плюс-минус везде там, больше, чуть меньше. И, наверное, это все, вот эта общая ситуация, наверное, у многих привела, во-первых, сфера развлечений, да, всякие там кредиты и так далее, настолько загоняют каждого в задницу человека. И об этом на самом деле никто так-то не говорит. Какое количество сейчас, допустим, даже в те же сложные времена такие, когда вот сейчас идет там специальная военная операция, да, где люди вообще умирают, в принципе, за какую-то сумму денег. То есть какая мотивация, то есть у мужика идти типа на войну, воевать и заработать денег? Потому что он вот в обычной жизни не понимает, типа, как реализовать себя. Он понимает, что он может пойти работать на какую-то работу, где зарплаты его все равно не будет хватать. Тут тоже двойственная сторона. Хорошо, когда она есть, плохо, когда ее нету. Да, вот это маленькая даже зарплаты. Но морально-то ты все равно подавлен. Ты понимаешь, да, я там пойду туда, но смысла мне этого не принесет большого. Да, у меня там станет, если я вообще не работаю и буду работать за 50 тысяч, хорошо, что они у меня есть, я смогу там покушать себе купить, но это же дизмораль. Когда ты заходишь в интернет и видишь, как люди там в Дубае летают, покупают себе огромное количество автомобилей какие-то, много всего такого, что ты за эту зарплату себе никогда в жизни позволить не сможешь. И как человеку оставаться морально типа сильным? Что ему нужно делать? Наверное, во-первых, это, наверное, все от семьи исходит, да? То есть, какая семья у тебя, как она построена. Если ты один живешь, это сложно, да, ты будешь сам себя, но у тебя, опять-таки, возможно, родители, если есть, которые друзья поддержат тебя в какой-то момент, хотя бы просто отвлекут тебя от этих мыслей. А если у тебя, к примеру, там, семья, жена, к примеру, да, есть дети, то тут, наверное, поддержка только от них исходит какая-то. Вот. Чтобы не упиваться в своих мыслях о том, что какая нынче сложная жизнь. И, наверное, других-то вариантов, в принципе-то, и нету. Какие вот еще варианты, в принципе, изменить, поменять свою жизнь настолько, чтобы она была, казалась тебе удачной, да, реализованным себя в жизни, в чем-то. В чем, вот как проявляется на самом деле у нас реализованность? Наверное, у 90% случаев это финансовое благополучие, финансовая независимость. Это, наверное, одно из таких ключевых моментов, когда человек, наверное, считает себя реализованным, да, в этой жизни. То есть, как добиться этого? То есть, с учетом того, что даже возьмем нашу страну, да, сколько миллионов людей здесь живет, как каждому добиться этого результата? Непонятно. И с каждым годом просто ситуация становится все хуже и хуже. Все дорожает, люди зарабатывают либо столько же. Ну, даже если они зарабатывают столько же, на самом деле этого все уже недостаточно. К чему это все приведет на самом деле? В оконцове, наверное, мир погрязнет в большую депрессию в какую-то. Какие-то войны, возможно, или еще что-то еще больше глобальных таких вещей, которые не приведут ни к чему хорошему на самом деле. Поддержка каждого человека именно для того, чтобы он держался, наверное, морально, заключается в том, что, ну, наверное, дом, в который ты приходишь, должен быть крепостью твоей, да, что это единственное должно быть место, где ты будешь чувствовать себя под защитой. Для этого было придумано, наверное, своя пещера изначально, потом свои какие-то чумы, палатки различные, да, потом все это превратилось, на данный момент это у нас дома, квартиры, в которые мы приходим и должны ощущать себя в безопасности, чтобы можно быть немного морально расслабленным с учетом того, что ты выходишь каждый день на работу, на улицу, и все равно давление вот это вот, оно все присутствует. Когда ты заходишь в магазин, видишь цены эти, да, и так далее, не можешь себе что-то там приобрести, позволить на ежедневной основе, это откладывает большой, наверное, отпечаток. Не, наверное, а точно. И поэтому, когда возвращаясь домой, ты чувствуешь, вот хотя бы есть типа уголок того места, куда ты можешь прийти. Уголок на самом деле человеку много тоже не надо. Можно хотеть большего, но на самом деле человеку одному много не надо. Да? Ему нужно спальное место, спокойное место, где можно подумать. Ну, это когда ты один, к примеру, да? Когда у тебя есть семья, к примеру, ты приходишь домой, опять-таки, и тут хотя бы, да, поговорить о каких-то вещах. Просто об отрешенных вещах, наверное. И, возможно, при этих же условиях у тебя и появляется какая-то дополнительная мотивация для реализации себя. А когда у тебя нету ничего, вот это уже становится проблемой. И это у многих на самом деле. Что значит не иметь ничего? Тут, наверное, самое главное, дизмораль у человека еще возникает при том, что это уже, наверное, где-то в глубине души даже она возникает при даже хорошей финансовой подушке такой, которая у тебя есть, хороших финансовых деньгах, да, то есть, но нету вот внутреннего ощущения, к примеру, дружбы, семьи, любви и так далее. Это уже отдельно на самом деле разговор, потому что мы, вот, к примеру, можем взять, как сейчас вот Новстрой, если кто-то смотрит, насколько тяжело обладать такими финансами и не иметь, по сути, ничего. Ни друзей, ничего не иметь. Так главное это получается для бедных главное деньги, для богатых главное какое-то внутреннее ощущение нужности, не из-за денег. Вот такое вот. И эта борьба какая-то такая и вот эти два слоя общества, богатые и бедные, они друг друга не понимают. На самом деле из-за этого, возможно. Потому что богатый человек, он уже не смотрит на деньги, он не считает эти деньги. Ему важно внутреннее вот это вот ощущение того, что он нужен без них даже. Это как Тони Старку сказали: а кто ты без костюма? На вот это я филантроп, тудым-сюдым, он сказал, да? Так и человеку, у которого много денег, ты задашь вопрос: а кто ты без денег? Ну, что ты представляешь себе без денег? Вот и это, наверное, возможно, таких людей богатых, как вот, например, там Мелстрой, задав ему этот вопрос: а кто ты без денег? Он на него ответить-то и не сможет. Обратная сторона людей бедных, да, вот если мы посмотрим, человеку